Hello everyone. This video tutorial will cover the functional aspects of the nervous system. And other concepts in this unit, you will take a look at the structural components, you'll take a look at cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The major difference and the major objective in this video tutorial and in this concept outline is to classify the nervous system based upon whether or not the structure is somatic or visceral. And we'll take a look at that as we move through this, but realize that this is simply just classification. Is it a somatic classification or is it going to be visceral classification? And we're going to answer those questions as we kind of move through this. But do keep in mind that both somatic and visceral will have, both of them will have afferent components, so it's going to bring back sensory from structures. Both somatic and visceral also have efferent components, meaning they're going to affect structures. They're going to have a motor component. And ultimately we're going to look at some example reflexes. We'll have to spend some time on the visceral end of things because when we get to the motor part, it's actually broken down into two subcategories here, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And you may walk into the course knowing a little bit about sympathetic. It's the fight or flight types of responses, and parasympathetic will be, rest, digest, maybe some reading there. So a little bit of review. The term innervate in Unit 1 simply stated that it provides nerve fibers to or from an organ. So when we say a nerve innervates a structure or a set of structures, it's providing nerve fibers to that set of structures and also receiving information from those structures. That's a key point. Our analogy in Unit 1 was Highway 71 innervates Cincinnati, bringing cars to Cincinnati and also back from Cincinnati. Then we need to make the comparison again like we did in Unit 1, efferent and afferent. This is review. Efferent was synonymous with motor, and afferent was synonymous with sensory. So efferent would effectively exit and go have an effect on a structure. Maybe it's a muscle, maybe it's the heart. And afferent would then is just the opposite. It's synonymous with sensory, so it's going to arrive with information at the central nervous system. Maybe it's arriving at the spinal cord or ultimately arriving to the brain. And so in this case, it's got to carry the impulse towards the CNS. And then we get to the classification. We said the classification is based upon what structures are affected, or maybe where the structures are bringing back sensory from. I don't remember what structures there is sensory being brought back from. So somatic deals with skeletal muscle, skin, and then the joint capsule, the muscle fibers, muscle tendons. The way you want to look at this is somatic efferent, meaning somatic motor, right, is going to affect or activate skeletal muscles. Somatic afferent or somatic sensory is bringing back sensory from skin, joint capsules, muscle fibers, and muscle tendons. If you look at the latter three, joint capsules, muscle fibers, and muscle tendons, you're going to say, well, why do I need sensory from those? The brain and spinal cord need to know what position things are in, maybe at the joints, so they'll look at the joint capsules. It needs to know what position the muscles are in to know how contracted they are, muscle fibers and muscle tendons. So keep in mind that all falls under somatic classification. Good example, if you activate biceps brachii, it's a somatic efferent neuron that got that job done. If you touch something hot, maybe it's the surface of your skin and we perceive that it's hot, a somatic afferent neuron told us that it was hot. Now, moving on to the second classification, visceral. Visceral is pretty much everything else, and that's the way you should look at it. Viscera means organ, and so the definition of an organ is just a group of tissues, which can be a very vague type of thing. It accounts for a lot. We can break it down for you and say, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, but pretty much smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, specifically in the heart, but smooth muscle and glands are found throughout the body. And so that's all going to fall under the visceral classification. So if you're activating a smooth muscle in the stomach, it's going to be a visceral efferent. Maybe you're activating a sweat gland, it's going to be a visceral efferent. Maybe you're bringing back sensory information from the intestines. Maybe you have an abdominal ache or a stomach ache. That's a visceral afferent fiber that brings that information back. So again, it's dealing with structures and classifying the nerve fibers based upon that. Before moving on, just realize that soma means body. So somatic meaning body, you're thinking, well, let's move the body or let's bring back sensory from the body wall, like specifically the skin, or let's bring back sensory information from the position of the body. So soma meaning body has meaning there. Viscera you can pretty much think as everything else, everything dealing with the organs. And again, an organ is simply just a collection of tissues. So those structures collectively will be innervated by the visceral component or visceral nervous system. So beginning here, now it's just a diagram breaking it down. Functionally, the nervous system is broken into, again, like we did in Unit 1, motor and sensory. Sensory is synonymous with afferent, so it's arriving, it's bringing information from receptors back to the CNS. And motor information is exiting the CNS, right? Exiting brain or spinal cord. So it's going to send motor information to activate structures or change the way structures are doing things. And so, like we said, both somatic and visceral have motor components, and both somatic and visceral have sensory components. And we'll break it down as we go. This was necessary. We felt that it was good to review this slide before moving forward. This slide was from Unit 1. And the skin receptors here will ultimately be giving us some sort of information about this woman's shoulder. To get that information back, we need an afferent neuron, okay, an afferent fiber. And we bring that back to the spinal cord. What we want to take a look at here is, yes, we call that an afferent neuron or an afferent nerve fiber. We just want to highlight that one of the focuses this time that we didn't focus on in Unit 1 is we will begin to focus on where are the cell bodies located that are either nourishing that fiber or actually creating the impulse itself. And so again, when we take a look at the sensory neurons, the sensory fibers, their cell body is going to be outside of the CNS. When we take a look at usually the first motor neuron, it will be inside of the CNS. So if we take a look at, maybe in response to whatever's hot, cold, or irritating her shoulder, maybe we need to move the arm in response. And so in that case, we would need an efferent neuron, an efferent nerve fiber, correct? And so that's when you have a cell body inside of the CNS saying, hey, we need to affect some sort of change here. And so this would be an efferent neuron coming out to affect the skeletal muscle. We visited this before, but remember that afferent sensory is going to be brought into the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, and motor will leave the anterior aspect there. So, still review. We have a presynaptic neuron because it's before the synapse, and postsynaptic neuron because it's after the synapse. And again, here's the synapse where neuron A is communicating with neuron B. This was the axon, and you see that it's attaching to either dendrites or maybe the cell body there. So again, transcribe your answers over to your concept outline worksheet. And we will first begin with somatic nervous system in detail. Again, soma meaning body. So, first taking a look at somatic afferent. It's a little bit of redundancy, and we've built that in here appropriately. This is not something you're going to get on the first time you hear it. Somatic afferent, you're going to think afferent sensory, sensory from the body. So we're looking at things like skin. We're bringing back sensation from the skin. Or we're bringing back information about the position of the body. Again, the joint capsule may be around a joint, maybe the knee, maybe the shoulder. Or bringing back information from the muscle itself, maybe the muscle fiber or the muscle tendon, so that the brain knows where and how contracted a muscle is. Just as sensory information. Somatic efferent is only going to affect or activate skeletal muscle, efferent meaning motor. Now, what do they have in common? Well, to get that sensory information back to the CNS from the periphery, it's only going to take one neuron. And to activate that skeletal muscle, from spinal cord over to that skeletal muscle, it's only going to require one neuron to get that job done. We will begin by looking, again, reinforcing the idea that the location of the cell bodies is important. Say there's a tumor somewhere. Say there's some sort of a deficit. Knowing where the cell bodies are located is very important. So the sensory fiber or nerve fiber is going to have its cell body in what's called the posterior root ganglion. And remind yourself that ganglion here just means a collection of cell bodies outside of the CNS. And if we take a look at the somatic motor part or somatic efferent, like we said, the cell body for that one will be inside of the CNS, specifically the anterior horn. Let's take a look at what that looks like diagrammatically. So if we have the sensory fiber here. And that afferent, somatic afferent fiber, it's somatic because it's coming back from skin. That somatic afferent or somatic sensory fiber is going to be brought back to the spinal cord, and notice that it's going to go posterior. Also notice that there's its cell body. That cell body's primary job is to take care of the neuron here, but there's its cell body. It's something called the posterior root ganglion, and we see that sensory information traveling along the axon, traveling again along the nerve fiber into the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. Maybe whatever's irritating that skin, or maybe whatever's activating the sensory receptors in the skin will require you to move the muscle. So now we have somatic efferent cell body sitting in the anterior horn, coming out anteriorly. One fiber, that's it, just one fiber, coming out and activating the muscle. Afferent again, say we tap the tendon. Again, this is affecting change in the position of the body. So activate a tendon, there's a stretch receptor in the tendon, there's a stretch receptor actually in the muscle itself as well. And we bring that sensory information back from that muscle, back from that tendon. Where's the cell body located again? Well, if it's somatic, it's in the posterior root ganglion. It just continues on, that impulse does, and ultimately comes back and finds the somatic efferent. What's the job of somatic efferent neuron? Well, it's going to go out and activate this muscle. What this is showing you is the patellotendon reflex. We sit down, we hit just below the knee, and the response will be to kick. Okay, it's activating that rectus femoris. It's activating the quads there. But again, just taking a look at the fact that the afferents are going to come in posteriorly. There's the cell body, and the efferent neuron, because there's a synapse, the efferent neuron will leave and activate the muscle. Again, focus on where the cell bodies are located. The sensory cell body is located in the posterior ganglion. If it's somatic, that single motor neuron is located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, as opposed to the posterior. So again, there we go. There's the motor neuron coming out and activating the effector organ. The effector organ, in this case, it's saying what's affected. It's skeletal muscle. When we take a look at a somatic reflex, there are two general types, a monosynaptic and a polysynaptic. The one that we just looked at, and we'll look at again here, is a monosynaptic, meaning we need this response to really just, it's engaging, we're engaging the tendon here, it's going to come back posteriorly. You'll see that it took a single neuron, afferent, right, to synapse onto the efferent neuron, and then we get the change. The difference between a mono and a poly is that the mono will have direct communication between that somatic afferent, that single neuron there, and the motor. The polysynaptic, on the other hand, what you'll find is that the sensory receptor, in the case of hot-cold typically, the sensory receptor is going to bring that information, or activate this neuron, better said. And this neuron, because it's coming back from skin, it's pretty hot on that skin, this is going to be a somatic afferent. Notice, again, just to review, cell body's in the posterior root ganglion, that somatic afferent comes posteriorly. The difference here will be is that it will synapse onto an interneuron. It will synapse onto an interneuron. Now, we'll tell you why here in a second. The interneuron is very short. It's going to synapse on the somatic efferent, and then you just need one of those to go from spinal cord out to the muscle. Now, why would this synapse on, say, an interneuron? The difference, here's monosynaptic. We don't really need to process much. We just need to respond. So you activate the stretch receptor, and it's more of a protective thing. It's going to respond by kicking. When you go to a polysynaptic, not only do we need to immediately activate the skeletal muscle, we also need to be simultaneously, hopefully it gets there fast, simultaneously telling the brain with a different neuron, simultaneously telling the brain with a different interneuron that it was hot. Okay, and it's important that we would be told that it's hot there. So again, now using the interneuron, we're able to do multiple things. We're able to, again, spread out the message a little bit, because maybe this interneuron is not the only thing, and this is the case here. The interneuron is not the only thing that this sensory neuron is ending upon. So That's ultimately why we have polysynaptic. Is it allows the sensory neuron to end on multiple things. We're just showing you the reflex to get that hand off the hot candle. So go ahead and transcribe your answers over to your concept outline worksheet and be sure to use the appropriate terminology in terms of the classification, whether it's somatic or visceral, afferent or efferent. And while we're here also, pay close attention to the location of cell bodies. So again, just an overview, a somatic reflex includes both PNS and CNS, so central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And again, just as an overview, you have a single neuron going from the sensation. This is somatic afferent. Maybe we need an interneuron, right, inside of the CNS. And then we find that motor neuron or efferent neuron. And ultimately what we'll find there is it's going to activate the skeletal muscle. Moving on to the visceral. The visceral is a bit more complicated. Pretty much somatic was one neuron in, one neuron out, and we just applied the terms. Visceral nervous system, what you'll find is that yes, there's an afferent component, yes, there's an efferent component. And the afferent and efferent are affecting things like organs, abdominal viscera, the gut, maybe it's the heart. We're bringing back sensation in terms of the condition of the heart, maybe some glands as well. The biggest difference is when we get over to the right here. To bring back a sensation from, say, the intestine, to bring back sensation from heart tissue, it's only going to take one neuron. Now, that's sort of, that reminds us of somatic. There's not much of a difference there. Okay, it's a difference in structure, difference in what we're bringing back sensory from, but it's still one neuron. And that one neuron will still have its cell body in the posterior ganglion. The big difference becomes when we want to affect change, when we want to activate something. That is going to require two neurons between spinal cord and the structure that's going to need the change, the structure that's being activated. Maybe it's smooth muscle, maybe it's cardiac muscle, or maybe it's a gland. There will be two neurons between spinal cord and one of these effectors, one of these things that are affected. And what we'll find is that the location of cell bodies is not as easy. It's not always in a specific horn of the spinal cord like somatic was. Somatic was always in the anterior horn. In this case, parasympathetic and sympathetic won't use the anterior horn. It's always going to be something else. So, as a general overview of the visceral nervous system, what we'll take a look at, we usually mention this a little bit with the structure as well. The cerebrum is really good for things like conscious activities. And then you move down to the hypothalamus. Now, sort of the command center. That's what we talked about here. When we get into the brainstem, the brainstem is where reflexes really begin to happen. Now, the brainstem is where reflexes can happen, but do realize that the cerebrum and the hypothalamus can really affect some of those reflexes in some cases, but not all. And so the brainstem is really just sort of a little lower down on the hierarchy, and then ultimately the lowest component of the hierarchy is spinal cord. But again, there's still some autonomic reflex centers there, specifically for defecation and urination. But what you'll find is the brain and spinal cord are really reflex centers, whereas the cerebrum and hypothalamus really start to affect the overall visceral nervous system on a higher level, because emotions get involved and conscious activities that you're deciding to do get involved as well. So brainstem, spinal cord more reflexive, cerebrum and hypothalamus more of a they're higher in the hierarchy itself, so they can affect a bit. They can affect the reflexes and oftentimes in weird ways. So just real quick, the term autonomic here can be considered synonymous with visceral. So if we're taking a look at a visceral afferent, we said visceral is coming back from organs. Specifically, maybe it's coming back from some aspect of the organ here. Maybe it's bringing back information in terms of the condition of the lung. And so that visceral afferent, we said there's only going to be one single neuron coming back. It's a visceral afferent because it's bringing back sensation. Maybe it's the position of the lung. What you'll find is that one single neuron, and this is very similar here, that cell body sitting in the posterior ganglion, this is sensory, visceral afferent, will end in the posterior horn. Now, the biggest difference will be maybe we need to ultimately affect some aspect of that lung. Maybe we need to um, constrict one of the blood vessels. Okay, maybe we need to constrict some blood vessels inside of that lung, and so the difference will be the visceral efferent will not just need one; it'll need two neurons to get there. So you have the first neuron, and then you'll have the second neuron. So again, real quick, identify number 1 and number 2 in terms of the afferents. And continuing with the afferent here, notice that we're showing you skin over here. And you guys know skin is somatic. We've already discussed that. And what we're doing here is we're showing you the similarities. If it's somatic afferent, one single neuron, there's the cell body ending into the spinal cord. Now we're talking about the intestine. This is not somatic anymore. This is visceral. And so in this case, maybe there is swelling of the appendix, which is down here. And we want to bring back sensory information. Again, still only one neuron to get us all the way back. Cell body still in the posterior root ganglion, still ending in the spinal cord. What we're making the point here is this. It only takes one neuron to bring back a sensation to the spinal cord. It doesn't matter if it's somatic from skin or visceral afferent from maybe from the intestine or from the heart. Now we're moving into the efferent. And like we said, efferent isn't going to need one neuron from spinal cord to organ. It's going to need two. And beyond that, it's even more difficult because we have two subdivisions. There's going to be sympathetic, and then there's going to be parasympathetic. Sympathetic, as you might have already been introduced to, is activated in fight or flight responses. Okay? Parasympathetic will be activated, will fire. Coming into the class, you probably always said rest and digest. We add rest, digest, and read to reiterate what cranial nerve 3 did for us in the cranial nerves. Helps you kind of focus. So rest, digest, and read. That's all parasympathetic for us. Kind of an overview. Regardless, what's common? Both parasympathetic and sympathetic will need a first neuron and a second neuron, and again, a collection of cell bodies outside of the CNS will be a ganglion. That'll be an important concept here. So we can call this first neuron a presynaptic, and we can call this second neuron the postsynaptic. So an analogy for this is sort of a connecting flight if you have a layover. So Indianapolis is the spinal cord. Maybe it's the brainstem, but in our case, we keep looking at the spinal cord. So that spinal cord will have presynaptic cell bodies. Okay, it's going to have presynaptic cell bodies. It's got a whole bunch of these. Okay, it's got a whole bunch of presynaptic cell bodies. And that presynaptic cell body sends its axon to Chicago. That's the first flight. Now, Chicago is analogous to the ganglion, a collection of postsynaptic or second flight neurons, right? And so then that second flight can take off to Miami. Maybe Miami is the intestine, and you want to move that food along, okay? Maybe Miami is the heart, and you want to speed up the heart or slow down the heart. What we're saying here is in order to affect an organ, in order to have a motor effect on an organ, you always will need from spinal cord or from the spinal cord to the organ. What we're saying is you will always need two neurons to do it. Okay. Now, from spinal cord to brainstem, again, just to reiterate that. The question that always becomes asked, usually right here, is why, and here's why. We'll take sympathetic for instance. We said sympathetic was fight or flight. When we're responding to something that scares us or makes us anxious, usually sympathetic activates a lot of things at the same time. Your eyes might dilate simultaneously, your hands start to sweat, you're getting more blood to your muscles, you're ready to run. A lot of things need to happen simultaneously. And so the benefit of this two neuron system is that one presynaptic, or maybe very few of them, very few presynaptics can activate many, many, many postsynaptics to get the job done efficiently. So maybe the heart is Miami. Maybe if we had a separate flight, as typically happens, maybe if we had a second flight to Texas, maybe that could be the intestine. Maybe there's a third flight over here to New York, and ultimately that could be a sweat gland. You can activate all of those things simultaneously, and to affect the system. So again, this 2 neuron thing is it's not as fine controlled, but you can get more done at one time. So it's kind of like having a messenger boy telling a lot of others what to do. So taking a look at the sympathetic first. Again, it's going to affect the gut, the heart, and some glands. That's visceral, period. Some specific functions to help us along: increase the heart rate. Right? If you're scared, your heart rate starts to increase. Maybe you're sweating simultaneously. I can guarantee you at that point, you're not wanting to digest whatever. And we dilate the pupil simultaneously. A lot of this is happening simultaneously, and especially in some of those stressful fight or flight situations. How many neurons did it need? Well, anything visceral efferent. This sympathetic is just one type. Anything visceral efferent will need 2 neurons. Specifically, what we're going to show you next, the first neuron is in spinal cord segments T1 to L2, specifically in that lateral horn you saw in the spinal cord. It's not using anterior, it's not using posterior, it's using the lateral horn, which really exists very noticeably in the spinal cord T1 down to L2. It's not the entire spinal cord, it's just those levels. That neuron will ultimately synapse onto a different one. Now, we don't really have time in this class to see all the different locations of these, but pretty much it's just going to be located, this ganglion. These ganglia are located somewhere along the sympathetic trunk, which is running up and down the thorax, or ultimately in front of the big artery in your abdomen. So we'll take a look at this real quick. The sympathetic, we said the first neuron will take origin from the lateral horn of the spinal cord, specifically between T1 and L2. That's it. The postsynaptic or postganglionic cell body, notice that preganglionic is the same thing as presynaptic. Postganglionic is the same thing as postsynaptic. The postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron will be in something called the sympathetic trunk, or it could be in another ganglion somewhere else. So what we'll see, what this actually looks like sort of functionally, is that the first neuron, pre, begins in the lateral horn, T1 to L2. It comes out and it finds a second neuron, and you'll see a bunch of synapses here, and ultimately maybe it's finding the second neuron in the sympathetic trunk itself, and then it comes out, that second neuron would, and activates a sweat gland, or maybe it activates that erector pili. Okay. On the other hand, it can come out and find a whole other ganglion in and of itself, and maybe it's coming out of the ganglion here and activating the heart. Okay. The idea here is this: the first neuron comes from the spinal cord, specifically the lateral horn, and the second neuron is in some ganglion outside of the spinal cord. Parasympathetic, again, still affecting the same structures. Sometimes in an opposite function though. So instead of increasing heart rate like sympathetic, it would decrease the heart rate. Now we're relaxing. Now that we're relaxing, we can promote digestive secretions. And ultimately the parasympathetic innervation moves the food along, called peristalsis. And now we're ready to constrict the pupil. Again, back to the reading. When we're focused up close, we don't want all the extraneous light. We can actually constrict the pupil, which is a good thing. You're not worried about reading when you're fight or flight. You don't want a dilated pupil when you're ready to read. It's hard to focus. So parasympathetic takes over and will constrict the pupil. Again, thinking back into the eye concept and also the cranial nerve concept. 2 neurons to get the job done. And notice here that the location of cell bodies for parasympathetic, one of 2 places. The brainstem, so cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Right? The brainstem will give you the first neuron. Or sacral levels S2, S3, and S4. Okay, the very distal tip of the spinal cord. The second neuron, the difference, a little bit of a difference here, is that the second neuron is going to be located at the organ, usually within the wall of the organ. We won't test you on the term intramural here, but within the wall of the target organ. So there's going to be a pretty long pre. Trying to find a very short little postsynaptic or postganglionic cell body. Let's take a look at what this looks like. Again, we're going to get our first neuron, our presynaptic or preganglionic, from the brainstem. Again, cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, or 10. And we get also the first neuron from a different area, sacral level, S2, S3, and S4. So functionally, what does this look like? Well, we already saw cranial nerve 3. It comes out and ultimately will affect things of the iris, for instance, or the ciliary body in the eye. Cranial nerve 7, parasympathetic, was good for the lacrimal gland, and it was good for the submandibular gland and sublingual, so salivation. 9, again, salivation again with another gland. And 10, 10, vagus nerve, is going to come out and really affect a lot of things. It's going to slow down the heart, adjust the lungs appropriately, promote digestion. And what you'll find here is, again, the first neuron was in the brainstem. The second, or postsynaptic, was in some ganglion somewhere that we really don't have time to learn. S2, 3, and 4 will give you the first neuron. And what you'll find there is that the second neuron is, again, right at usually at the surface of the organ there. Okay. One reflex, micturition, or it's the same thing as saying activate the voiding of the urine, right? Is now we have a visceral afferent. This is just sort of applying some of the terms. We have a visceral afferent fiber. And like we said, visceral afferent, you only need one to get from organ over to the spinal cord. Okay? You're only going to need one neuron to get from the organ over to the spinal cord. This neuron is letting the spinal cord, probably the brain as well, know that the bladder's filling up. Okay? The bladder's stretching. And the sensory receptor and sensory neuron is perceiving that. It's carrying that information back to the spinal cord. Remember, cell bodies are in that posterior ganglion. The nerve signal is then processed in probably a very short integration center, and we're ready for a response. Now, the response is going to come out of simply because this is going to be parasympathetic down in the lower half of the body. It's going to come out of the lateral horn of S2, 3, and 4, and come out and actually find a second neuron. Notice how small that is because it's at the organ. But again, we still used 1 and 2 neurons to void that urine because this is visceral. This is visceral efferent. You need 2 neurons to get the job done. Now, reflex number 2. This is just an example, a different example. Something we've already talked about in the discussion with the cranial nerves as well as the eye. 2 different concepts. This is again just pulling it all together, hopefully. Now, parasympathetics. Parasympathetics are really going to activate the sphincter pupillae to constrict the pupil. The idea here is, we said parasympathetic was rest, digest, and read. You're resting, you don't need as much light coming in, you don't want as much light coming in, and we can actually add the read statement there. You don't want as much light coming in if you're trying to focus on something up close. So, where's that coming from? It's coming from cranial nerve 3, which we learned was a parasympathetic cranial nerve. If you remember, cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 give us parasympathetic innervation. 3 is oculomotor because it's going to the eye. On the other hand, if we want to dilate the pupil, that's not a parasympathetic function or reflex. That's a sympathetic function or reflex. And ultimately, where's that going to come from? Remind yourself that sympathetics only can originate. That first neuron can only originate from the lateral horn of the spinal cord, specifically T1 down to L2. Because this is so high up in the body, the eye is, it's going to receive fibers from T1 and T2, very upper limits of that segment. When sympathetic takes over, the pupil is dilating because that dilator pupillae is really, really working. Again, one of the reflexes that we really want to focus on is parasympathetics of cranial nerve 3 will activate or fire when maybe light is shown in the eye. And the idea there is it's protecting the back of the eye. It's limiting how much light can reach the retina. Okay, if that pupil gets smaller, if the opening gets smaller, because parasympathetics cranial nerve 3 activated the sphincter, less light will hit the back of that eye. It's very protective in its nature. A lot of times parasympathetic is, we say rest, digest, and read. There's also times like this where it's very protective. Sympathetics will originate from, again, the lateral horn, specifically T1 and T2 of the spinal cord. and activate the dilator. And again, since the dilator's winning here, it's kind of like a competition. Sphincter's losing, dilator's winning, which means the sympathetics are firing much, much faster than the parasympathetics, and you get dilation.